Welcome to Mooney Reads. My name is Beck, and today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in the month of April. So in April, I read 15 books, about a quarter of which were nonfiction, the rest were fiction. Of those fiction books, a couple were sci-fi fantasy, one of them was a classic, and then two of them were kids' books, and then the rest were young adult contemporary, and most of them were Heartstopper or Heartstopper adjacent. And then the nonfiction that I had were a mix of like social science and self-help. So far as the mood of what I've been reading, I read a lot of reflective, emotional, and lighthearted books. That took up about half of my reading. And I definitely enjoyed most of what I read. 6 of the books that I read were 5 stars. 5 of them were 4 or just above 4 stars. I had a couple that I didn't rate because they were kids' books, and then a couple that were around 3 stars. But even those weren't necessarily bad, and I'll get to that. So I'll go ahead and get started, and I'll talk about them mostly in the order in which they were read. Remy, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? I don't know if y'all can see her back here. She's leaning on me. So the first book that I read in April was Between Perfect and Real by Ray Stoeve. I actually listened to this on audiobook, but I bought the book a little while ago. I really enjoyed it. This is the story of Dean, who's a closeted trans boy who gets the role of Romeo in his school play. The only problem is that everyone thinks he's a lesbian and that he will be playing a lesbian Romeo. So he has to figure out how to navigate the play as well as like his friendships and relationship and parents, deciding whether or not to come out. I really loved a lot about this, in particular how trans community was portrayed, both in terms of kind of the physical space that he has, and also the online space, like the little details of that, I thought was really wonderful and accurate. I also think that the way that the relationship was handled was really good. I don't want to say really too much on it because I don't want to spoil anything, but I think that it was handled really realistically and done well. There was a bit at the end that felt maybe a little bit much, but no more than I think is expected with the young adult genre. Really, the thing that I loved about this most, like why I had such a good time reading it, is that it was very much like a quintessential like young adult, but queer, which shouldn't be, you know, some kind of great feat, I feel like, but it never gets old experiencing just young adult books that are where the queerness feels genuine, like it's not something that's shoehorned in. It doesn't feel like fiction, but like as a way to educate people about trans people. It's just a trans story. So that was really wonderful. Next, I read I Think I Might Be Autistic by Cynthia Kim. This is a book written by someone who was diagnosed later in life. I think she was 40 when she was diagnosed with autism. And a little bit she does talk about her experience, but this is mostly about like the steps that she went through to get diagnosed. But the vast majority of the book is really tools for people to basically help themselves reflect on the autism criterion and figure out whether or not they want to get diagnosed. So there are lots of lists of examples of what might fit the DSM criteria, which I think is really helpful because a lot of the criterion is vague, and like they provide some examples, but there are things that aren't in like the 3 examples that they give that would technically fit the criterion more broadly. So I thought it was very good. Obviously it's not like by a doctor, but I think that she's very clear about her perspective and her intent with the book. And it's definitely a good tool for anyone who is thinking that they might be autistic, or anyone who wants to know more about kind of the process that people might go through figuring that out. After that, I read one of the kids' books, but I'll go ahead and talk about both since I don't really have much to say. I read Mommy, Momma, and Me in the Middle by Nina LaCour and Jailani Juanita. It focuses on a little girl who has two moms. One of her moms goes away on a business trip, and so she's just dealing with her feelings around that. It's really cute. I really loved the art, and there are a lot of really cool details, like a lot of like the background characters and classmates and whatnot are also quite diverse. It was a sweet read. The other kids book that I read was Perfectly Pegasus by Jessie Sima, and this is a follow-up to their other book about a unicorn that was raised by narwhals that I forget the name of. But this was really cute. It's about basically finding friends, but also like being able to be yourself. Really sweet. Both of the kids' books were good. I don't typically give them star ratings because it's just harder with kids' books, but they're really sweet. After that, I can talk about Black Skin, White Masks. I finished this buddy read with Brent. Damn. I mean, there's a lot happening. This is a psychology book that focuses on the impact of colonization, in particular looking into the psyche of Black people in Francophone colonized spaces. Though I think that a lot of pieces of it are applicable outside of just, places that have been colonized by France. But that's the specific, there's a lot of cultural stuff that's specific to that, that's discussed, as well as colonization kind of more broadly. He's having this discussion and analyzing all of this, in part using literature from certain places to kind of illustrate his point. He also goes into kind of different psychological theories alongside his more like cultural analysis. Largely, I think, to kind of criticize some of those frameworks and basically show that they fall short, especially when talking about people who aren't white and European. There was so much in here. I definitely could see why people would read and reread this, how there have been so many people that have been inspired and like written like after this referencing it. There is just so much happening. I will say, it was published in the 1950s, so there were some things that dated it, like there was definitely some homophobia in parts, but as a whole it's way more progressive or aware in a lot of other ways than most things written at this time, especially in the field of psychology. One thing that I really appreciated about this was how clear his voice is. The way that this gets like told is very interesting, and part of it I think is like French people and like that's the way that they write, but part of it is like making his opinion and at least pieces of like parts of his political prerogative like very clear. Like there's no attempting to like sound objective, especially when you're dealing with things like racism that are like morally wrong. There's a really big tendency in writing that's deemed political or that's talking about political issues where if you like sound like you're coming from a particular side, your writing is less valid, or you have to sound as though you're not on either side, which isn't objective, it's dishonest. So I really liked that we were able to see kind of his voice and his perspective throughout this whole thing. Do you really need to like smack me? I'm trying to film a video. Rude Kitten. Did you have thoughts on Black Skin, White Mask that I didn't cover? Is that what this is? Rude. After that, I started listening to the audiobook of The Queer Art of Failure by Jack Halberstam. This incorporates social science and film critique. He is looking at a lot of film that's sort of considered like lowbrow and looking at different themes within it to talk about particular things societally. So he looks a lot at animation, and also like kind of like silly movies, basically. He ends up talking about queerness, a fair amount of political things, what failure is, and kind of how a lot of those things connect. Some examples of things that are explored throughout the book. We got a Marxist analysis of Chicken Run, a thorough discussion of the queerness of Dude, Where's My Car? And what it says also about failure and how those two things are tied together. Like their misunderstanding or not understanding of like why they should be homophobic is seen as something that makes them like less intelligent. One of the, I guess, kind of problematic things about this book, or I wouldn't even really call it problematic, but one of the things that they do, like when talking about some of like the phenomena, like in Dude, Where's My Car? The guys, like, they don't know what they're doing. Like, but they talk about like stupidity as a theme or as a tool. That's not necessarily accurate tool, but like in a lot of movies, people not understanding or being really silly, stupidity or like perceived stupidity is a thing that is used within movies. So they kind of look at that as a concept and how that's used like to indicate failure, but like they look at the subversive kind of nature of it. I'm not going to be able to get all the points that they get in that book in a video. I honestly don't think that I absorbed all of their different points because there was a lot happening. But that's just how it is. That's just how it is. The one real issue that I had, like I thoroughly enjoyed listening to a lot of this. I love like the hyper analyzing stuff and like finding themes and things that you wouldn't think. There were themes that I love that, like queer Marxist analysis of the Beat movie. Like, hello, yes, I would love to listen to that. But they try to tie in towards the end queer history and the issue with the story of queer history that often gets told, and the view of like throughout history only seeing queer people as victims. The way that they do this, though, I don't think, well, first, it felt shoehorned in a little bit. Like, it wasn't the same, like, not all the chapters had the same format, but this one felt a little out of place. But also, I don't think that they focused in necessarily on the right things. Like, I could see pieces of what they were saying, but I think that they missed some things. Specifically, they were kind of critiquing this idea that all queer people historically have been like the victims in a lot of these different situations, and specifically talks about the Holocaust and how like obviously queer or well, not obviously, if you know about that part of history, you'll know that queer people got sent to concentration camps, and also later on queer activism kind of reappropriated or adopted the pink triangle They did some before the AIDS epidemic, but in particular, like around the AIDS epidemic, it was flipped and used in a lot of artwork and stuff like that. And he criticizes the use of it in part because he talks about how there were some masked white gay men who were who kind of like sided themselves with the Nazis. And there's definitely a history, an issue of anti-Semitism within parts of the gay community. Like if you look at even some of the bigger queer authors, Patricia Highsmith was a giant anti-Semite. There's definitely room to talk about that, and definitely the difference in how different people within the queer community are treated, gender non-conforming people and people of color, definitely facing kind of a different trajectory than people who fit and intentionally align themselves with those norms, which that's similar to we can see a lot of examples of people who are in a marginalized group aligning themselves with the privilege that they do have at the expense of other people. That's not new or something that's unique to queer people necessarily. But he's basically saying that like that piece needs to be acknowledged, which I do think that we should be talking about the nuances of history, just to be able to talk about the nuance of privilege and oppression. But I do think that I think that the criticism that he gives of reappropriating the symbols, I don't know if there's enough nuance in that. I particularly just because looking at the queer movement of the 80s, which I have been reading a fair amount on, there are a lot of Jewish people involved. And while a lot of people of color don't get spotlighted necessarily, you know, the gay movement hasn't just been masked white men. And if it were just the masked white men reappropriating the symbolism, I think that it would be an issue. But I don't know. I think that the conversation that they brought up is interesting, and it's important to talk about those messy pieces of history. But I don't think it's something that they should have attempted to do in a chapter. And this is like, there's also a layer of irony or something, because I'm talking about a place where I feel like this book failed or fell short when the book is about failure. But I don't know. I would really like to see perspective of Jewish people and people of color, in particular, looking at that to really know. Like I said, it felt like an interesting beginning of the conversation, but it didn't feel complete. And when talking about all of this too, I felt like it was more of like I didn't feel like the issue of white supremacy was centered enough in the conversation as well. So those are my critiques. But this is only one chapter in the whole book. I do like the idea of bringing in like the storytelling of queer history within this larger conversation. But so those are kind of my thoughts on that book. It was definitely an interesting read. If you're interested in that sort of thing, media critique and queer studies and so forth. After that, another graphic novel that I read was Network Effect, which is the 5th book of the Murderbot series by Martha Wells, and it was really good. It was the first full-length book. It was about twice as long as the others, and I had a really good time. It was very enjoyable. I loved seeing a longer Murderbot book, Not really going to talk much about what's in it because it's book 5 of a series, but I'm really loving it. I'm super excited. I'm a little concerned because I think there's only one more that they have an audiobook of, and then there's a collection of, maybe it's not a collection of short stories. There's a 4.5 that's I can't find as an audiobook. But I think the 4.5 and the 6 are the only ones that are out. And I'll have to wait, which is frustrating. But yeah. After that, I read The Body Keeps a Score by Bessel van der Kolk. This basically looks at the history of trauma treatment, specifically looking at the author. The author has been involved in the field of psychology for a really long time. Starts out talking about how there wasn't really like a word for that, or there were words rather, for talking about trauma and trauma related issues, but information about that was often suppressed, largely by like governments who didn't want people to know that war would fuck people up. And then from there, he kind of talks about the change in trajectory from like acknowledging it, and trying to treat it in different ways, to the move to psychiatric drugs, and then some more modern treatment, talking about EMDR, and other kinds of like group therapy, that utilize acting kind of. I got a lot out of this. I definitely learned a lot. He talks about a lot of different people's stories, though with that, there should be a lot of content warnings on this book, because while it does very much, like, I think that it was useful for me, they do talk very, bluntly about trauma that people have been in the middle of. So talking about details of atrocities during war, talking about assaults and incest, and so there is a lot there, just like as a forewarning, but it was still very good, getting to hear about these different types of treatments and really how trauma works, was a really big thing, and different people's like reaction to trauma. He talks a little bit about DID, and that was interesting too, especially seeing it contextualized within what trauma is, because it, at least the way that he described it, it is just like, that's your body's reaction to trauma. That's just a really intense manifestation of it, but it, it makes sense. It's not something that's super out of left field, because it's literally just what your body does with trauma, just to a very extreme degree. I thought that what he talked about, especially towards the end, looking at how theater and stuff like that can be used to help people, was really profound. The importance of sharing people's stories and being listened to, different methods for like teaching people. If I go into all of the details, I'll be talking for way too long in this video. This wrap-up's already going to be very long. I will say that it would be interesting to get other professionals' opinions, because there are certain things, I'm not a psychologist, so I can't say for sure, but like his like opinions, I think, on what the best treatments are, like heavily color this book. So it would be interesting to see other perspectives. For example, he critiques medicine a whole lot, which I think absolutely needs to be critiqued. I think that there are a lot of doctors that don't do their due diligence with that. But it kind of sometimes goes both ways, just depending. Doctors over medicating, and then sometimes like people have a harder time getting access to certain things. So I think that there's more nuance required in the conversation. especially when, you know, there are a lot of people who probably could get better with other treatments, but there are also some people with certain disorders who need medicine, and that's okay too. So I thought more of a nuanced conversation about that would have been nice. Also more discussion of neurodivergence in trauma. I would really like to hear more about that in general, but I've not had a lot of luck. So if people have books or like YouTube videos or something to recommend, let me know. But he does mention ADHD a fair amount, but whenever he does, it's in the context of people who were diagnosed with ADHD when their ADHD symptoms were actually symptoms of trauma. So they were incorrectly diagnosed. But it would be really nice to hear about people who have ADHD and autism and are also traumatized, especially because when you go through a world that is like very much not made for you, and the way that you think is seen in a really negative light, and you get punished for kind of acting based off of that, that in and of itself is a traumatizing experience. Or like another example, going through a world that's like way too overstimulating and having people tell you that you're like overreacting or not like accommodating for that. There are a lot of things, depending on the person and their neurodivergence, that, you know, just living in a world that isn't fit for them can be traumatizing. So it would be interesting to also see the intersection of that, and not, I thought that just saying these people didn't have ADHD was like, left something to be desired. But regardless, it was a really good book. I really am glad that I read it. It was super, I think that it was helpful for me. I see a lot of people recommend it, and I do think that it's kind of a mistake that I haven't seen that many people talk about the content warnings. Like, obviously it's about trauma, so like it's going to be heavy and whatever, but I didn't expect the war crimes or the like kind of detailed discussion of like assaults and stuff like that. Thankfully I was in an okay headspace, but just definitely be aware going into that. The next book that I listened to was The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is actually a reread. I read this for the first time as a sophomore in high school, so 2008, 2009, and I have not read it since then. And I'm not going to talk about it in this video because I actually did start to talk about it, and I clearly need to make a whole video on Gatsby and the retelling that I'm going to get to in a minute, because I have a lot of thoughts. So hopefully that will happen. But Great Gatsby, had a lot of mixed feelings about it, like as a book. However, so far as a reading experience and like an analyzing experience, like if you really want to like dig in and like critique or like put pieces together, this was a really fun time. Also, like, I don't think that these like tabs necessarily do it justice, because I have a lot of thoughts outside of what I actually put in the book. I mostly listened to this on audio, and then this is a copy that I had, so I bookmarked and added some things. All of the orange ones are where either Gatsby, or not Gatsby, where Nick, the narrator, like, shit is not heterosexual. So things like when he is drunk and with a pantsless man in his bed, that got a tab. But also stuff like his description of like women versus Gatsby. Oh fuck, I don't know where this went. I guess I'll figure that out. Things that basically indicate that he's gay, I did with orange. Now the white ones, or yellow, fuck, I've got to figure out where this one goes. This was the racism. This book was very racist. And some of these are like one-off comments, but there are a couple that are like I didn't put in everywhere, like every single instance, like if there's like, you know, 3 pages of them talking about the Jewish character that's in here, for instance. I don't put a tab on every page. But there was some really racist shit, and that's where I have mixed feelings, because I can't tell, like, he didn't really explain that. So it's hard to know how racist the author is, basically. But I have a lot of thoughts, so I'll probably put a separate video up about Gatsby. And The Chosen and the Beautiful, which was my next reading. This is a great Gatsby retelling that focuses on Jordan Baker, which is kind of the girl that I would say that Nick sees, but he, like, literally says that she's nearby, and he felt like he needed somebody to, like, focus on or whatever, because everyone else had a girl. So, like, that doesn't seem like a romance, but okay. Anyways, I'm not gonna get into that. There's a whole other video for that. But this focuses on one of the side characters in The Great Gatsby. But in this retelling, it's a fantasy setting. There are demons and other sorts of magic, and the main character is was adopted from Vietnam. So it's still like the 1920s in a lot of different ways, including the racist ways. So it's kind of her and what she's doing. And this, again, I had mixed feelings about Gatsby. I have similar mixed feelings about this book. Not Gatsby, I have more mixed feelings on because of the racism, but like the story as well. Like, I don't know if I would not have enjoyed the story if I wasn't overanalyzing it like I do. If I were a different type of reader, I would not have really liked it. And I think that partly extends to The Chosen and the Beautiful. Granted, there is more interesting shit in The Chosen and the Beautiful than in Gatsby, by far. I thought that the magic stuff was interesting, though I'm not really a world building person, and I still kind of wish it was explained more. I can kind of get the metaphorical, like, resonance or whatever of some of it, but some of it I still didn't see. I didn't understand exactly what was or I understood what was happening. I didn't really understand why some of it was, just because there was no real world building, or no explanation of the world building. But as a retelling, this was really great. The pacing was very similar, and the mix of, you know, having bits that were really, really detailed, but at the same time, like, having that layer of, like, really intense dissociation. I think that they captured that perfectly. All the characters are pieces of shit. They got that down too. It was definitely Gatsby, but, like, elevated, because there is the interesting pieces with the magic. They also do a whole lot and end up talking about certain issues of racism. Not in a way that feels shoehorned or, like, preachy, but in a way that definitely makes sense. And I would definitely have liked to, like, hear more about a lot of these different details, but it doesn't. I think that I understand, like, why there wasn't as much world building, or why we didn't get more about certain things. And a lot of it comes down to just how The Great Gatsby is. Like, that kind of detachment, like, you don't get the full story, and that's kind of part of the point. So I really appreciate how it was done, and I think I initially gave it like 3.5 stars, and I'm still iffy about whether or not it should get more, just because if I knew nothing about The Great Gatsby and I read it and didn't really think that much into it, I probably wouldn't like it that much. But as a retelling and seeing it in its full context, I think it's really brilliant. So I had a really good time with Gatsby and The Chosen and the Beautiful. And I have a lot of other thoughts, so hopefully I'll do a video on it. And after that, the rest of the month was Heartstopper. It was all Heartstopper. I reread all 4 volumes. And then I finally got this winter and Nick and Charlie, and I read both of those. And I mean, we already Heartstopper. Do I need to say anything? The whole internet has been up about it. I'm probably gonna make a Heartstopper related video too. Not that everyone and their mom isn't, but it's just so fun, and I've already thought about it a lot. I'm like a bookseller too. Like I work at a bookstore, so between being on the book internet and being over there and talking about Heartstopper, recommending stuff related, I need to just do a whole thing for it. But it's cute, it's adorable, it's everything. I'm obsessed. I've also watched the show 4 times now. And I'm not stopping anytime soon. Some might call it a problem. But Nick and Charlie and this winter, it was the first time I'd read those. I've not read Solitaire. They're technically Solitaire novellas. My copy of Solitaire is coming in the mail. And this winter, I really liked, this takes place during the Christmas of Volume 4 of Heartstopper. And you get Tori's point of view, Charlie's point of view, and Oliver, their little brother's point of view. And I think that this handles mental health really well. Like, I think it's very realistic, the kind of issues that come up, because a lot of people don't really understand, especially people who don't deal with that particular mental health issue, or even sometimes people who might deal with mental illness to a certain extent, especially if they're not getting help. I think that it's really easy for people to misunderstand or not take things as seriously for other people. So I think that that was done really well, but I also really loved seeing like kind of the sibling interaction, especially as someone who is a sibling. I'm the oldest sibling, and I have 8. It's kind of a split up sort of situation because my parents are not together, but I have 8 younger siblings. So that was just really sweet to see, and I liked it a lot. And then Nick and Charlie takes place at Nick's final year of school, kind of within the last few weeks. And I won't say too much about what the exact like problem is, but they go through a problem. There's a lot of angst. But again, like I thought that it was really realistic. Like that was a realistic issue to have, and also the fact that they had a problem talking about it. Like, I don't really like miscommunication as a trope, but I think that given who Charlie is, his kind of thought process, and what we get in the story, it does make sense. And it was very personal to me because I've definitely been in that kind of headspace. Like, I spent way too long in relationships, like, doing shit like that, not talking about stuff because I thought that it would make the other person feel bad. Because I thought that I was bad for feeling a kind of way that I shouldn't. And he certainly resolved it a lot faster than I did. So, yeah, I thought was really believable and felt a little personal, but it was also nice to see them kind of overcome and all that. That's all that I finished reading. I also read part of a few things. I worked on Let the Record Show as a part of Tome Topple. I did get through the first part and into the second. I'm over 100 pages into it, which is a little sad, but Heartstopper happened. So, you know, that's just how it goes sometimes. I did work on it though. That was the goal. I got a good chunk done. And I will hopefully continue to read it. And and not set it down until next round of Tome Topple, which is kind of what I did last time. But it's excellent. I've put a lot of my thoughts on camera. I started to do a vlog that I'm realizing I never finished because I got heavily distracted by Heartstopper and I kind of stopped reading this. So we'll see whether or not that goes up. But even if that doesn't go up, whenever I finish this, I'll do a more in-depth thing on it. It's very good so far. They're talking about a lot of nuanced things in this group. I think that the thing that I really like about this is that she talks about the complexity of history. We can even think back to the Queer Art of Failure and some of the stuff that I was talking about with that. Like, he was kind of saying that we kind of tell just the one story, but the way that she's doing this, she's talking about so many different people's experiences and makes it really clear that each of these people did have a different perspective of like even who ACT UP was, just depending on where you were in it, and is talking about all of these very different sides of it, who is contributing what, and even the fact that someone who could do so much good for the group can also participate in negative things as well. So kind of holding those hard simultaneous truths is just really cool. So that's Let the Record Show. And I also started Melt With You by Jennifer Dugan. This is an arc that I have. This comes out this month, so I need to read it, finish reading it as soon as possible. It's cute though. It's romance, best friends that had a falling out, but their parents own, their moms own an ice cream truck that they both have to work at. So they're kind of, I think, forced to deal with the issues that are there. I'm not gonna lie, in the beginning, which I'm not that far into it, we're just now about to get into, I think, the actual, like, stuff that's going to happen in the story. The beginning, there's a lot of miscommunication, which isn't great. Like, the two are definitely not on the same page, which is kind of frustrating, but hopefully it will get better. I think that it would be nice to read a sapphic story that is not focusing on a Virgo. It doesn't say that she's a Virgo, but there's very, like, Virgo with a Pisces placement fucking them up somewhere, like that situation very much. That's like Honey Girl was definitely it. One Last Stop, she was a Virgo, but not nearly as messy as some of these other people. Like, Seek a Therapist, and maybe we can have someone who's not a Virgo. Nothing against some Virgos. I need a different character archetype for a minute. That might be kind of an unhinged piece of criticism. I'm so sorry. But I think it's gonna end up being cute. I'm excited. I really like the really punny names for all the ice cream. I think that the main character is definitely getting some backstory that would kind of explain some quirks and tendencies and whatnot. And I think that we're gonna see, I think that this has potential for a lot of, like, character growth and stuff like that for both people, because both of them, like, they seem to be messy in, like, very different ways. So, I think it's gonna be cute, and hopefully this will be the first book that I finish this month. I also started reading Spectrums, Autistic Transgender People in Their Own Words, which is an anthology focusing on autistic trans people and kind of their experiences. I didn't get super far into it because Tome Topple started, and then Heartstopper happened. But it's very interesting so far. I'm excited to get more into it. I think that this is a really important perspective that we don't really get to hear a lot from. I feel like I hear a fair amount about it, but that's just because of TikTok mostly. So it's really good to be able to actually see it and hear more about people's perspectives. I've got 2 more books that I actually worked on throughout the course of the month and just managed to forget about because my brain has been nothing but Heartstopper. I did start the audiobook for Narrow Tribes, which focuses on the history of autism. In the beginning, I don't really want to say too much about my opinion just because I didn't get very far into it. I listened to it. I might finish it later. It's not really a priority, especially compared to some books that I want to read that are like written by autistic people, like the Spectrum's book. But that is something that I listened to for a brief amount of time. And then I also picked up Decarcerating Disability, which I'm actually really excited about. I think I picked this up right before Tome Topple, which was a terrible decision because I put down what I was reading in order to focus on Let the Record Show. But this is gonna kick ass, I think. I didn't get super far into it, but like the introduction was just fire. It was fucking excellent. So this one I'm definitely going to be focusing on in the coming month. The final book that I worked on is my reread of Summer Suns. I read Summer Suns, I think in January, and I immediately started a reread because I'm fucking obsessed. Like, I still love it. Like, I know that this reread is taking me forever, but it's because I have to be I have to be totally focused on it and in a position where I can highlight and do the tabs. Like, I'm this far into it and we have so many tabs. And I'm like noting certain thematic things and whatever. So I'm taking my time and my brain is what it is. So it's not going to be very fast. But since I'm already in the mindset, hopefully I'll be able to work on this some next month. But who knows? I certainly don't. I'm still I don't even think that I'm going to be putting out a TBR, honestly, because for one thing, like last month, I was thinking about May. Wires got crossed and I started to talk about Asian American Heritage Month, which is definitely in May and not April. But, you know, that's fine. Basically, all the shit that was on my TBR that I didn't get to rolls over. So, hopefully I'll get to work on this continuing. But we'll see how far I get in any of this in the coming month. But that's what my reading for April looked like. If you've read any of these, definitely let me know about them in the comments. And thank y'all so much for watching. Bye.